Thanks. So that actually leads us into the next line. So suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified. So Christ was crucified, which on the one hand does clarify the method by which Christ suffered and died. Like that's not up for debate or discussion. It's not like, oh, Jesus died of natural causes, or he was stabbed to death, or he fought like in a battle and just sort of shot by an arrow or
Yeah.
something.
He died.
Like
He retired, died of old age.
yeah. But it also doesn't leave room for we don't know how Jesus died. We just know that Jesus died. We don't really know how, or it doesn't leave room for well, Jesus was able to escape death. Like crucifixion was a very, it was intended to bring about a lot of suffering, and it was also intended to kill someone, and the Romans definitely knew how to do it. When we say Christ was
Fairly good.
crucified, like he was dead, like
It's that
he
all
was,
nature you're
yeah,
talking about. Like it's pretty gruesome stuff. Didn't they?
yeah. Have you ever
Oh, I'm
what?
sorry.
Yeah, so there was, I don't know if you've ever looked into it on a personal level, anyone who's listening, on how someone like how a crucifixion works. Like it's miserable. Like the way that you die is actually by suffocation. Like you suffocate to death. So like when it's sort of funny now that I sort of know the mechanics behind it, which I wish I didn't know. But now whenever I see like a movie depicting Jesus' death and everyone is just sort of like stationary on a cross, like it's actually not how it was. There was a lot of like physical movement involved because
You got
the way your arms were set, it pinched your airway. So you had to keep moving up and down to be able to breathe. And so people over that's why they broke the legs. That's why like the centurions went up and they were like, oh, let's break the legs of the thieves. Let's check on Jesus. Oh, he's already dead. We don't have to do it. Well, they would break their legs so that it would force the person to not be able to lift themselves, and then they would just suffocate. So fun fact. Well, not a fun fact, but it's a fact. Anyways, the point is that Jesus was crucified, and it was gruesome. Crucifixion, not ideal.
Wasn't there some like Greek rulers or not Greek Roman rulers that like would line like during rebellions? I don't know. I think this might have been pre Jesus. I don't know. Maybe post. I can't remember. But they like lined a road with like people on cross, like rebels on crosses. So like literally like driving into town with billboards, like you had these like dead people hanging to be like, hey, guess what? Don't rebel against Caesar because this is what's gonna happen. Is that a thing? Am I making this? I swear I read this somewhere.
I think I've heard that too. And it reminds me a lot of Vlad the Impaler. So I know it was a common thing that that rulers did to intimidate people. I mean, it would be
Very
effective.
fascist thing.
Yeah.
So
Um, so it is interesting though that is a line in the creed that we claim he was crucified because that is pretty specific. Like crucifixion is not uh, like to say the word executed. Like crucifixion is referring to a very specific type of suffering and death, which I don't know. I don't know how often you really explore the significance of the fact that Jesus was crucified, like as that method. I don't know, how much is actually in there. We hadn't planned on really talking about that, but if you're ever curious, look into that. I guess if you really want to.
yeah,
Um,
it's
I mean, maybe one of the values of it is the fact that Jesus knew that was going to happen, but he accepted it anyways. I think that goes back to what you were saying that of how much of human experience Jesus willingly took onto himself to the point that he would endure one of the worst forms of suffering, uh, which is emblematic, I guess, of human experience and the fact that we do suffer a lot of time. We might not suffer a crucifixion, but we suffer a lot in many different ways. And the fact that Jesus took that on and like
like 10 minutes.
willingly was like, yeah, I'll do this. So the last part we're going to talk about is that he was dead and buried. Which I mean, Jesus experienced death like that. That's groundbreaking in and of itself. And there's scriptural references to this, like the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. Which, interestingly enough, I was watching a debate between a Jew and a Christian, and the Christian kept bringing up how Jesus fulfills the prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament, and they brought up Isaiah 53. And the Jew, I thought, made a really good point, and they were like, "But that's just the uh, Isaiah's description of the suffering servant. That's not really a messianic prophecy." I guess I never really thought of it like that, which is pretty interesting. But even in that, like Jesus exemplified. uh, that model. Um, so I just found that interesting. But then also like Psalm 22, like when Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Um, but which is actually the opening line of Psalm 22. And if you read through that whole psalm, it is like it's pretty fascinating how it is describing Jesus's own experiences of being crucified, like vividly. So I'd encourage you to read that in light of the crucifixion, just as a note. But just as say, like Jesus actually did experience not just suffering, but also death. Which the next line of the creed. I'm sorry, it slipped my memory earlier. The next line of the creed is actually he descended to the dead. So some translations, some of the ways we'll translate that is like he descended into hell. So like he went where dead people go. um,
That's gonna be
you
a
know
fun one.
that is going to be a fun one. And a lot of people are actually really put off by that line, so I'm looking forward to exploring that.
Yeah, that one's
Uh,
gonna be good. But the main emphasis here, though, for our purposes, and especially for this line, is that he did physically die.
yeah.
Yeah, which is a big deal
Hmm.
because remember, saviors don't lose
Hmm.
and kill God or can.
Right. Yeah. And uh, I know we were done with this, but kind of going back to the crucifixion point, some of the claims against Christianity were that, okay, well, you claim Jesus died, but I mean, come on, he probably didn't actually die. Like, he only seemed to be dead or something like that. And it's like, no, the Romans knew pretty well how to kill people. Like, if Jesus was still alive, they would have known. Like, he was dead. They went through all of like the burial procedures like properly, and then they actually put him in a tomb. Like no one thought that he was faking it. No one expected that tomb was ever going to open up again. Like the disciples were terrified. His followers fled because they thought this is it. Like he's dead. There's nothing else. Um, yeah, just to emphasize, yeah, Jesus did die.
Yeah, no, it's a big deal, and it has a lot of significance. At least for us as Christians, trying to figure out where to start because there's a lot to say here about that. Um,
Yeah, there's a lot to say.
I think when I was in college, I first started to think about this, and I think even as I'm getting older, I'm starting to experience it in a different way. I think a lot about my own mortality. Like maybe you guys have taken an intro philosophy class, you've heard of existentialism, right? And a lot of that is about like what it means to be, right, to live. And a lot of it, like really, like philosophy is a study of trying to have a good life, or at least that's how the ancient Greeks thought to be, in particular, like Socrates and Plato to some extent. Um, Existentialism really focuses on like our existence here and now. So it doesn't ask questions like what is true, what is real. It really asks kind of different, more internal questions like who am I? What does it mean to be? You know what I mean? Like kind of the stuff like Hamlet saying in his soliloquy, like to be or not to be. Um, it's really, and I say that jokingly, but it's really powerful stuff. Like when you think about death, like it's an event that all of us have to face, and like there's a joke that my dad and I say about basketball players that father time is undefeated. Like every great player gets old and they have to retire.
Hmm.
Every person runs out of time eventually, though. So it's true in a lot of other ways. Father time is undefeated, right? Haven't lost yet. We all eventually pass away, and our time runs out at some point, whether it's tragedy or old age. Uh, but death is really real, and it's a really human condition. So let's talk a little bit real quick about kind of like the biblical model and like the Jewish context of death. Um,
Okay.
so at least this is what I wanted to do when we're talking about dying, and it's something that I had thought about quite a bit. And I'm going off notes here, so I apologize, Ben. But in the garden state, there was no idea of death. Like death wasn't a conception; it didn't exist at this point, at least not in the way we understand it now. There's this perfect kind of eternal idea, and before the fruit is eaten, well, let's say this, after the fruit is eaten, right? That's when like the fall of man happens, and that's when the idea of death and pain enter the world. This is a theological point that some theologians like to use. I don't know the Hebrew well enough to tell you how good that is. Maybe Ben would be better suited to tell me if I'm right or wrong here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the Hebrew word death, there's really only one word for it, and it just means death. Like there's not, it's like in Greek you have different words for like different types of love. In Hebrew, you don't have different words for different types of death. It's just death. So it makes it difficult to interpret that passage sometimes.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Um,
So I don't know if that's the point you were getting at, but that's all I can offer
No,
from
no,
a
no.
Hebrew perspective.
I was trying to make sure I wasn't like misinterpreting it. What I'm really trying to get at fundamentally is the idea that when the fall of man happens, or the way the Jewish culture understood it, that when the fall of man happens, death enters the world in a new way, right? And we're no longer in that perfect union with God, in those kind of like special bodies that we'll talk about in the resurrection. So we're gonna like set up a lot of stuff in this podcast, at least in my opinion, Ben. Tell me if we're wrong about when we talk in the next couple podcasts about resurrection, because
Hmm.
this all ties together as a bigger narrative. But death is a really big deal because it's a type of suffering that is unique to fallen and sinful man. That's what I'm trying to say to you.
Yeah.
It's unique to a flawed world, right? Because if you've ever lost somebody, it is incredibly painful. It's incredibly painful. And that's a type of suffering that's different. And even in like ancient poets and literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh is like a great story, right? When like Enkidu dies, like Gilgamesh is like, you just like, he goes on this like emotional rampage. It's crazy. It's really sad,
Hmm.
right? And like, we people write about it as the worst kind of pain, losing somebody you care about. And this is the wages here that like we're talking about. So if God and Jesus hadn't died, then he wouldn't be fully human, because to be fully human to some extent is to be mortal, but also to have the risk of being able to lose,
Hmm.
is to die, and to like feel loss, right? Like Jesus was sad, like Jesus wept. Like they killed his cousin John the Baptist, who probably had a pretty significant role in his life. I mean, this is the guy that like was going out and saying, "Prepare the way, the Messiah is here." It's a big deal, right? And they're related. And so my point is this: that his death is really a big deal because it really focuses on the connection, that relational human nature of man aspect, right? Human nature aspect of who God is. So as we're talking about the creeds and as we're kind of going here, I really want to tie it back to what they're combating, that Gnostic view that he wasn't, but also how
Hmm.
we see it today. I think sometimes we tend to course correct one way or the other. And in our churches, either we talk about God in way too godly language, like Jesus is like this magic being that runs around and like, you know, zaps magic invisible like fixes on things. We talk about him because he is God, and he could do those things. But we got to also understand that like he suffered like us, and he paid the ultimate price, right? Like he died like we're all going to. Um, so he lived in a very real sense of full and complete life. Does that make sense, Ben? What I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
he can understand humans, and we can connect to who Jesus is in a way that's fundamentally different because of his death, right? Even if we
Yeah.
haven't experienced it, we've been touched by death before, right? I don't think there's a
Hmm.
single listener who could probably say, I haven't been aware of someone dying in my life and it hasn't
Yeah.
impacted me at all. That's absurd.
Right. I mean, I think that claim makes sense. I mean, put it into relation. I might cut this out because I'm not at all trying to make a political statement, but it seems very similar to a lot of the conversation that's happening now with like the protests of like, uh, going to try to say this as generically as possible, where one people group is saying another people group needs to be able to understand their experiences.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they don't really get them.
Yeah.
We can't say that to God because he, like what you're saying, he did experience everything that we go through. So we can't say, well, God, you don't know me. Like, you don't know my issues. You don't know the pain that I'm feeling. We can't say that because he experienced it.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And I don't think that's a bad political point. I think you're just explaining the situation as it is. So you didn't take a side. I think that's fair. You can keep that in.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that, and I think that's really good. And so I know I went off notes here, but I wanted to say that because I really want us to understand like the significance of Jesus' death, like what it means. Like it, when he experienced death, he experienced being human, like we experience being human, and that's the connection
Mhm.
to make there. And I think there's more to be said. Now, Ben, you had another point here that I really, really want, if you'd be willing to kind of like kind of go off here, because your next point here, kind of this one right here, is
Mhm.
is really good. and I just think that no one can me to like you, to be honest. Like I know it's not a good transition, but it's really good stuff, and I just am really excited to talk about it.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a soapbox, and it's also ironic given the whole topic of this podcast is on Christ's suffering and crucifixion and death. But I do think that as Christians, we need to be cautious of overemphasizing any particular part of the oh, what's it called?
Cross,
The
the death,
Yeah, the cross certainly.
crucifixion.
But I mean, in more broad, the Jesus moment. What's that called? The Christ experience, whatever. We have to be cautious of overemphasizing any particular piece of Christ's birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection. Um, so here's an example of it, because this is actually a part of American Christianity, and where American Christianity, I think, gets hung up too much. So I'll illustrate this with a story. So several years ago, I was attending a church. They were having a Christmas service, a children's Christmas service, and one of the songs they chose, it started off, with Mary and Joseph, but then towards the end of the service, they began to sing this song. It's actually called the Christmas Cross, I believe. I think it's actually pretty common. I might be offending some people by bringing this up, but just follow me on this. This is an important point. Um, and the song lyrics essentially go, what is this all about? What's the point of this Mary lady? What's the point of Joseph? What's the point of Jesus? And the chorus is about, oh well, it's all about the cross, right? It's all about the sacrifice. And then this Christmas special ended with, it was so funny. It was like a metaphor. It ended with people taking the manger scene off the stage and just bringing a cross out and just setting it there. And that was the conclusion of the service. And I remember joking with some people that I went with, and I was like, man, that is such a depressing service. I mean,
Yeah,
if Jesus can't even survive,
that's
yeah,
it.
if Jesus can't even make it through a Sunday morning, uh, we have no hope. But I mean, I was also really frustrated though, because I'm like, if you're going to start telling the whole story, you don't end it at the cross. You have to end it at the very least at the empty tomb. Really, it should be Pentecost and further on. But uh, the fact that that became emblematic of a greater trend in American Christianity, where we get so focused on, like, hyper focused on the cross. And I'm not at all trying to diminish the value of the cross, but but in focusing so much on it, it diminishes everything else. So, I mean, an example is, I love Michael Tate. I do. Uh, I followed him way back when he was in DC Talk. Like, I mean, you know, bro.
Just dated yourself.
But yeah, so Newsboys came out with a song. I don't know exactly when. I think it's the last couple of years.
All the gins
Uh,
were like, who?
yeah, yeah. So the Newsboys came out with a song called "The Cross Has the Final Word," and like that is the theme of the song. Like, no matter what happens, like the cross has the final word. And I just remember listening to that song, and I'm like, that is such bad theology. Uh, the cross really, if we really want to center everything on the cross is actually the victory of sin, because that's where Christ died. Um, the tomb is the victory over sin, right? The resurrection is the victory over sin. Um, but again, like that, also going back, that does bring value to the cross, because that is where our sins were paid for. That's where Christ paid the penalty. But when we focus so much on it, it just it blows. It just covers everything else up to the point that we struggle to really understand the value of the incarnation. We struggle to understand the value of the virgin birth. We struggle to understand the depth of the value of the resurrection, because everything has been overshadowed by really what has become essentially an over exaggerated relic of the faith. So there's a line in a movie. The movie is called "Do You Believe?" And in a sermon that the pastor of the movie is giving, he actually says the line. He's holding up a small wooden cross, and he says, "This is not just a symbol. Like, this is the way. This is the truth." And I remember watching a commentator, Say Goodnight Kevin. He's a YouTuber. Look him up. He's awesome. Uh, he's reviewing this movie, and at that line, he just says, "Wait, that little cross is the way, like just sort of jokingly. But I think that's a good illustration for how the cross has sort of usurped uh, the the life and ministry of Jesus,
Yeah.
where to the point that we construct so much of our theology around the cross instead of the person of Christ, um, which I think is very, very dangerous and
Yeah.
it makes me very uneasy.
Can I add to that? Because I can tell you, I've
Yes.
experienced. I want to share a personal story about my faith journey.
Yeah.
Um, when I graduated high school, back in the old dark ages of 2010, I spent the summer traveling with an evangelist. Now, I'm very open about this. I traveled with a Nazarene evangelist. I grew up in the Church of the Nazarene. So some of the stuff I'm about to say after I finish this story, if you're not Nazarene and you tend to be more Reformed, we're probably going to fundamentally disagree on these particulars, but in the broader picture, we're both serving the same God and who Jesus is. So it really doesn't matter. But I'm just going to use this to illustrate some points about God and the way we think about the cross and what Ben's saying. Um, I interned at this church and this ministry and this evangelist, and a big emphasis of his sermons as an evangelist was the concept of dying to yourself, right? And it really emphasized like the idea of the cross and like take up your cross and follow me, and those are really powerful things because there is fundamental truth to that, right? Like we do need to die to our selfish ways, right? And I think that's part of what's emblematic of the cross. The problem is we really didn't talk about resurrection or hope very much. In fact, I can't remember a single time we did talk about it. And someone could probably go pull the sermons from all the times I sat with this guy. They were recorded pretty frequently and put up online.
Yeah.
And you could probably hear that this is not the case. I don't remember, but I remember the teaching and the cultural aspect of it, right? The interactions that I had with people. And a lot of times the language that would be used is you just got to die to yourself here, just be less selfish, and it became one of those things where it became unhealthy to the
Mm.
point like we weren't worshiping or really talking about God anymore. It became about myself. It was a veiled and I don't think this was the intent of these evangelists. They're actually really, really good godly people, for the record. Um, but I think the way they worded things kind of led us this way, or at least they allowed it to go this way if not kept in check. And I didn't think I was kept in check. But it became like this kind of weird narcissistic thing where like it took a long time to get over it. I felt like everything I did in my own Christian walk had to be interpreted through the lens of is this going to be some kind of like holiness? So it became like an intellectualized, like supercharged form of legalism, right? And that's what I'm saying here is because like when he died to pay my debt, if you don't have the rest of that story, which we will get to, and I don't want to spoil too much, right, about like hope and resurrection and what it means to live a resurrection life, then really what you're left with is like God has saved me, full stop, and that's the end of that sentence. Well, that's a very incomplete, excuse me, understanding of Christian theism.
Hmm.
Because that becomes essentially glorified fire insurance, and it leads to a lot of things. In my case, it led to like a legalistic understanding because like I wanted to keep that and I wanted to participate in that, but I didn't know about the hope and the power of the Spirit, and the idea of dying to myself and taking up the cross just became this kind of like self-flagellation and restriction. Not that like you should not go see things or do things. You should absolutely avoid certain things that are harmful. That's not what I'm saying. But it got to the point where I wasn't able to have like real meaningful discussions or understand art. And I avoided things in pop culture that didn't really matter. And now, why is that a big deal? I think I lost some abilities to connect with my community, which is a really big deal, I think.
Yeah.
It was a big deal for me at the time. Um, and so what I'm saying is this, that when we focus on only the theology of the cross, which is to say we only focus on the death and the way he died and how he died and that he died, and we don't tell the whole story, which again we'll talk about later, we leave ourselves open to this kind of lifeboat thought. And Ben, this is what I think you were getting at. So do you think I'm onto something here?
Yes.
Yeah. So you leave yourself open to this idea that like the point of all this is for my salvation. And if that's what you think, I really want you to listen to the next couple episodes because you're right, but you're also really, really wrong.
Mhm.
Like you're right because he does want a relationship with you and he wants an eternal relationship with you. And yes, that is one of the fundamental ideas. But it's like an incomplete sentence, right? You know, it, what did I say earlier? It was like I don't
He
remember.
says like half of a sentence.
Yeah, it's half of a sentence. Like yeah, I guess the thought makes some sense, but
Yeah.
there's so much.
Christ died for my sins is it's not the whole story.
Yeah. And again, we're doing a lot. I'm doing a lot of preview because I don't want to talk about the resurrection, but I'll touch on it briefly. Because if you
Mhm.
don't understand the death of Christ, right, and his burial, without the understanding that he gets raised from the tomb later, which is what Ben was mentioning, and then ultimately, and Ben's probably really right on this, and I've neglected this too, all the way through Pentecost, which is honestly very, very powerful stuff. But if you don't acknowledge the reality that he, at least at the very minimum, was resurrected again, you're fundamentally missing the point of all this, right? Because the idea is that that was the event that conquered what it means to be fundamentally human. I went on this big soapbox, and Ben backed me up
Yeah.
on it about that.
I think we're both standing there together. I mean, it's true. Like, and I think so. Focusing on the cross, I've heard a lot of evangelists and pastors and leaders also talk about, like, well, Christ paid the debt for our sin, and that's the only way to do it because like we can't get there just by following a bunch of rules, so we can't be legalistic because that's not going to save us. But I also find focusing on the cross exclusively actually, like what you said, leads to legalism because the natural next thought someone has is, okay, I've been saved from my sins. Now what? The cross really doesn't answer that question.
No.
That's why you need the full story. That's what the empty tomb is. The empty tomb is the now what. Um,
And
so yeah, like
the cost section that you're talking about is the beginning of living that Christian life. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think it does. It actually does lead to legalism because you have to answer that question. And like from your own experience, if I'm understanding you correctly, and what you said was that actually led to a form of legalism. Like, well, I have to figure out how to live this way, and this seems to be the way to do it, which is just going to be, it has to
Yeah.
look different than everything else,
Yeah.
like because that only makes sense. So therefore, legalism. Not
Yeah.
trying to, yeah,
It's just a different, it's just I was like a veiled, sophisticated form of it, but you're exactly right, Ben.
yeah,
And beyond that, I will say that it doesn't leave you with a lot of hope, either neither the legalism nor the idea of the cross.
yeah,
And I really, really am going to be emphatic on this in our next couple podcasts. Hope is the fun, is the blood that runs through the veins of Christian thought.
yeah.
And if
Because like every great religious movement has had its leader die. Like that in itself is not significant.
yeah,
Um, and there have been deaths that have had been very much impactful. Like you think of Martin Luther King,
yeah,
which I will actually. There's a connecting point here. So a while back there was a movement called the Emergent Church Movement, like capital E Emergent Church, and one of the leaders, I forget his name, but I remember we discussed this in class, and we were discussing the theology behind the movement and where it could lead. Um, the person who actually started that movement in like an organized form actually went down the rabbit hole and concluded one of the last things I heard him say, like as an instruction or as a theological reflection, was that the death of Christ is really no different than the death of Martin Luther King because it just showed a good way to die. Um, but if you focus on just the cross and you neglect the empty tomb, you can actually get to that conclusion because yeah, Christ's death was significant, but without the empty tomb, like you just miss so much of that. Because yeah,
yeah. So that's the takeaway that we're trying to get at with this podcast, because we focus on the line about suffering and death, and we talk about the human nature and how, because of that, he can participate in that. Right? We're tying this all together. But
yeah,
know that you can't stop at this podcast. And yes, I'm 100% plugging our next one, but I'm doing it not because I want you to listen. Well, I do want you to listen, but not because I want listeners, because I want you to hear what we're going to say about the Christian faith. This is a plea not of self benefit, but of passion, right? Like, listen,
mm,
because you're going to miss out on something really, really important. We don't talk about hope. This is actually the line of the creed that I've been most anticipating. I've been excited about a lot of stuff because I like to nerd out about this stuff, but like, this is the one, and Ben is just laughing at me here. This is the one that I have been like most passionate about. This is the thing
mm,
that I've read and that I've embraced that's fundamentally changed my life, and I can share some stories about that maybe next podcast. And there's a lot of really good resources out there to kind of help you walk through and navigate that. But the resurrection is the lens that we got to understand the death in, or at least we got to be willing to finish the sentence. If you're going to remember it in a nice little metaphor, we got to finish the sentence here. Otherwise, you might get pulled one way or the other, and you might get brought into that lifeboat theology that we've been really critical of, because it's not about that. And we'll talk about that.